Welcome. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Grania Fitzsimmons. I am a professor in the management area here at Fuqua. So if you haven't been taught by me or you weren't taught by me back in the day, what I teach here at Fuqua is negotiations and our core management class that we call LEO in the daytime program, Leadership, Ethics, and Organizations. What I do the rest of the year is research. I am an experimental psychologist and I study motivation and self-regulation. So the kinds of questions that I look at in my research are what's going on in the workplace or the general environment that might make people be more or less successful at their goals. So like the title of the talk says, how do people get things done and what goes wrong? Those are the questions that drive my research. So before I begin, I'll just remind you, we have Fuqua faculty here talking about new research on LinkedIn the first and third Wednesdays of the month. Today, what I'm going to present is some research on motivation, so some new stuff not yet published. And I'm also very happy to take whatever random questions you might have about your own motivational problems or those that you're having with other people you work with, employees, friends, any kind of motivation issues that you might have for yourself or others. I'm happy to take, so you can just leave questions in the comment section. And I am going to share my screen. What I want to talk about today is motivation. And what I'm going to suggest to you, let me just pause by saying I wanted to remember to highlight Jessica Paik, who is the PhD student who is conducting the experiments that I'm going to talk about today. She is the person who came up with the idea and the one who's doing all the work. So I'm just describing what she has done. So what I'm going to try to explain to you today is that motivation is not a reliable source of action. So if we want to get stuff done, we often kind of wait until we feel motivated, right? So I'm tired right now after lunch, or I don't feel like working right now. I'm just going to wait until I feel motivated, right? And then some motivation arrives, like a fairy dusting glitter on you, and then you're going to do your work. Or I want to just acknowledge that obviously this audience is a very accomplished audience, and that means that you have gotten good. You have developed skills at doing things, right? You're a successful and accomplished group of people, but even the most successful people can struggle day to day with their motivation. So one of our very good friends, who is a very successful entrepreneur, contacted my husband and me the other day saying, how am I getting motivated? Like, how do I get motivated to get my work done? And particularly what people often struggle with is motivation to do the difficult things, the stressful things, or the things that make us nervous, or to pursue those big dreams, right? So you might have a goal to, move into a whole new field in your career, but oftentimes I think people get to the end of their career having never felt like it was the moment to begin that, right? Never feeling motivated to take on such a big challenge. So my work tends to study goals at a very granular level, because I want to control things as much as possible. So I don't want to measure people over their lifespan. I want to experimentally manipulate things in the lab and see what happens. So we'll be looking at kind of small time goals, but I believe that these kinds of effects happen with larger lifelong goals as well. So my main argument is that motivation is not the thing we should be relying on to get stuff done, okay? It is very flighty and it is very fickle. It responds to all kinds of situational stuff, and those structural things in the environment often drive then whether we feel motivated and whether we succeed. But I think we can develop some strategies to get around that. So given that motivation is fickle, we can do a couple of different things. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. We can try to protect our motivation. I'll give you one example from experiments that we've done. And then we can also just put motivation aside. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so we know from a lot of research that motivation, or the feeling of wanting to get something done, right? That feeling of being engaged, passionate, excited, wanting to finish what you're working on, right? That's what we in psychology call motivation. So that's the driving force behind our action. Certainly, motivation is helpful. If you feel motivated, you're a lot likelier to follow through on various kinds of plans. And when you feel motivated, you tend to get a lot done, right? You can compare like 1 hour of yourself sitting in your apartment where you've just been scrolling social media and doing nothing, and then another hour where you've managed to accomplish a lot of different things, right? And oftentimes you're feeling really motivated while you're accomplishing those things. So motivation, definitely good. But there are days, even for the most successful and accomplished among us, there are days in which we just don't feel motivated, right? Or there are specific things we're supposed to do that we just don't feel very motivated to do. Or we're just kind of waiting for motivation to strike to do a certain project. So given that motivation has these ups and downs in daily life and that a lot of us don't feel motivated when we need to get stuff done, what are the kinds of things that make motivation go up and down? I'm just going to give you one example. If you're interested in this topic, I can give you a lot of previous research on all kinds of studies to read or summarize them for you in an email. But let me just start by telling you about what Jessica and I have been doing, which is looking at motivation as it is affected by our beliefs about what goals should look like and what our progress should be like. So what we think is that people expect progress on their goals to be linear, okay? So let's say you want to speed up your running time for a 5K that's coming up. What we suggest is that people on average, runners will expect their times to keep getting faster with each run, okay? So you might want to lose X pounds a week or shave X minutes off your run time or get X amount of sales per quarter, save X amount of money per paycheck, okay? And what Jessica and I suggest is that we expect X to be a constant, okay? We expect even, steady progress. So we expect to be able to go, a certain number of seconds faster this week and then a certain number of seconds faster the week after. And we expect that to be a constant. So when people make weight loss plans, we know from the dieting literature that they tend to make a plan of losing about a pound a week. And so they expect to be, 1 pound this week, 1 pound next week, 1 pound the week after that. However, that is really not what goal pursuit looks like, right? Most of our goals require us to keep working in an extended pursuit across time, right? Not just a little quick thing. And so usually we have obstacles, we have setbacks. We lose 2 pounds one week, but then we gain a pound the next week. Or, we're making progress towards saving, and then we have a leak in our roof, right? So something comes up that changes our progress, and we don't get that kind of steady, smooth progress that we expect, okay? So what we thought was that motivation, being, as I'm describing it to you, this kind of fickle, flighty, ephemeral thing, that it would change depending on how smooth or bumpy the progress is, even if the progress is great, okay? So let's say I plan to shave 40 seconds off my run time over the next month, and I get to 40 seconds by the end of the month. I'm at 20 seconds halfway through, but it was 0 seconds the first week, 40 seconds the next week, then 10 seconds, and then 30 seconds, okay? So bumpy progress. So let me show you what that might look like, exactly what I mean. So on the y-axis here, we have units of goal progress, okay? So let's say each of these is how much faster you're going to get on your marathon time, okay? And these are units of time. So let's say these are each of your long runs that you have scheduled before the marathon, okay? What we expect as people in this culture, and I am going to tell you up front that I don't know if this is a universal expectation or if people in other cultures have a better grasp of what's happening. In our culture, what we expect is basically linear progress. We might be okay with a few bumps in the road, but we expect to see it be more or less the case that at week 2 we'll be faster than we were at week 1, and at week 3 we'll be faster than we were at week 2, etc. But actual progress, as I've been saying, looks a lot more like the pink line where we're up, we're down, we're all over the place. And so what we are suggesting and looking at in this research is that we will feel unmotivated as goal pursuers, as people trying to do stuff, every time it's the case that we have some bumpiness, okay? So even though if you look at unit 4 on the figure, even though the pink and the blue lines are the same at that point, right? We have made the same amount of progress. We're right on track with our goals, 4 units of progress in 4 weeks. If it's been bumpy, we're going to feel less motivated. That's our hypothesis. So I'm going to just show you a couple of experiments. This is an experiment with a math task, and it's a difficult math task for our population. We had 400 participants do this task for pay, and their goal was just to get better than 50% correct. Okay, if they did that, they were going to get a small bonus. What we had people do is half of them had smooth progress towards earning the bonus, half of them had bumpy progress, okay? Sometimes they got them right, sometimes they got them wrong. It's important just for you to understand that in order to make this task work, we made the task really hard, and then that allows us to have very ambiguous accuracy, okay? So participants in the study don't really know if they got them right or not, and so we're able to give them false feedback so that they believe they're either making smooth progress or believe they're making bumpy progress. That's important to us experimentally, just to control, because if we looked at people who made smooth progress versus bumpy progress, presumably they'd be different in a bunch of different ways. So we want to control that very carefully in order to be really sure that it's about bumpy progress rather than being about something else. So what we did is we stopped them halfway through when they were manipulated to have made equal progress, and we measured their motivation. So the manipulation looks like this. You don't need to see all the details, but basically every 4 rounds, they get some feedback about how many they got correct. In the even progress condition, every time they do it, they find out they got an additional 2 right. So they're right on track. They're staying perfectly on that straight line. Okay, the uneven progress condition, sometimes they get 4 right, sometimes they get 0 right. And so it's up and down. At the end, they are at 10 out of 20 when we interrupt them to ask them how they're feeling, how motivated they are. What we find is what I've been suggesting to you is that even though they're at the equal point, right, they're right on track with their goals, just the fact that it's been a little unpredictable, it's been a little up and down along the way, that feels frustrating to people, and it makes their motivation temporarily less, and it makes them thus quit more, right? So if this is the case, what can we do? So the first great round of strategies for protecting ourselves from the fact that motivation is flighty, okay? It's not actually rational for us to be less motivated at this point because we are equal in terms of our progress and we're right on track, okay? It just didn't look quite how we thought it might look. And so we don't feel as excited and as in control, right? And so we temporarily feel less motivated. So what can we do? The first strategy that I'm going to tell you about is to try to protect or boost your motivation itself, okay? So motivation going up and down all the time, right? You read something on Instagram that, made you feel a little sad and now you're less motivated, or, you saw like a friend being super successful and that made you feel a bit less motivated, right? So what do we do to protect ourselves? There's a lot of research on this. And again, if this is something you're interested in, I'm happy to share data and summaries with you. But an example might be a reminder, right? So you might put a reminder, you're on your way to CEO on your laptop screen, right? You need to stay committed in order to get this long-term goal done. Also, accountability to others is an example. If your mom is counting on you to come through with something, you're more likely to come through. So those are the kinds of ways we can take advantage of motivation's flightiness by sort of bolstering it, right? So we looked at another way to protect motivation by looking at how changing our expectations of goal pursuit might matter. So here we had 734 participants in an online study, and we basically just told them that science has shown us either progress should be steady, right? That's a kind of normal default way. Okay, so we had them read a fake Scientific American article that summarized what research in psychology tells us about goal progress. And it either told them that, yep, it sure does tend to be linear, or it said, nope, it sure does tend to be bumpy. And so we basically just told, allayed those fears they might have so that when they got to a bumpy road or spot in the road, they would feel better. That was our hypothesis. We had them do a weight loss scenario. So we had them imagine they were trying to lose 6 pounds over the next 12 weeks. And it either went half a pound a week as they planned, or it went all bananas, but still ended up at the same place, which was 3 pounds total over 6 weeks. Okay. And so then we're going to check in midway through their goal pursuit again, or imagine goal pursuit in this case, and see what happened. And what we're interested in here is this manipulation where we told them, hey, it's okay for goal pursuit to be unsteady. Does that help them? So when we look at motivation in the normal conditions, that's the condition where they read that, yep, goal pursuit tends to be steady. We see that when they experience uneven weight loss, okay, the weight loss goes up and then it goes down and then it goes up the way that it normally does in weight loss, what we see is that people feel significantly less motivated. When we change those expectations by saying, we've realized that actually goal pursuit is pretty bumpy, then we see, hey, we get a smaller effect. This effect is still significant. So people are still less motivated in the uneven than the even condition, but as you can see, it's a much smaller effect. So we are doing something to bolster that motivation. Okay, so we know that strategy 1 can be a little bit effective, right? It's not going to take away all the problems of having bumpy progress, but it will be a little bit helpful. Okay, so I do hope that that's one strategy that you keep with you after the talk is when you experience an obstacle, you gain a pound after 2 weeks of dieting, that you don't just freak out and think to yourself, this is a freaking disaster, this is totally not working, and quit, okay, which is what many people tend to do. Instead, or you go for that run and you're expecting to be faster and you're slower and you're like, what? I've been faster 3 weeks in a row and now I'm slower. What's important to recognize is that's what goal pursuit looks like. And you should tell yourself that, and it will maybe protect you a little bit. The other strategy that I want to suggest, it's a bit more controversial, I think, is I suggest that you just remind yourself that you don't need motivation to do anything. So let me walk you through what I'm thinking here. We know motivation is fickle, right? It's going to respond to all kinds of cues in the environment that you don't have any control over. So if you're relying on it to get stuff done, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, boy, I better, wait until I feel really motivated, or I'm just going to quit too early. If you're waiting to feel like now is the time to tackle that big project, now is the time to reach for my dreams, if you're waiting for that to happen, you're probably going to lose an opportunity to pursue your goal that doesn't require you to have that, okay? So rather than focus on keeping ourselves psyched up and bolstering our motivation and putting little motivating sticky quotes on our screens, my real suggestion to you is to consider thinking of motivation as something that's lovely, nice to have, a gift from the universe, but not necessary to do what it is that you want to do. Okay, so writers often talk about this, that you just have to, Stephen King says in his book, you just have to sit down and write, whether you feel like it or not, right? So research has shown us two important things. One is that just getting started tends to bring motivation along with it, okay? I'm sure there's been tons of times when you've been sitting around your apartment feeling pretty unmotivated, and then you've begun a task that you want to do and actually started to feel that passion, that commitment, that excitement, that willingness that is motivation after you got started, right? So just getting started is a huge increase on motivation. So if you're finding that you can't get going, one major thing to try is progress. But then it's also very much shown in research that you can be really productive without feeling motivated. So you don't have to have that ephemeral fairy dust, right? You can just do the thing without the feeling, knowing that the feeling is likely to come along, but also knowing that you don't need that feeling. You're fine. You can do this thing without it, right? So what I want to suggest is that our culture has kind of led us to believe that we're entitled to motivation in order to produce, okay? We're entitled to feel excited and passionate and committed. But what if that's not necessary? What if motivation is not a birthright, but a lovely reward from the universe that we can earn by doing things, okay? And I think that framing of motivation is much more helpful than the one that has us sitting around and waiting for it to strike. So if this is you, I'm not lazy, I'm waiting for inspiration to hit me, should be here anytime now. If this is how you're thinking about motivation, to try something new, to move to a different place, to start dating again, whatever it is that you're considering doing, if you're waiting for motivation, I want you to think about maybe recognizing that motivation doesn't have to be like a muse to artists, okay? It doesn't have to be that fairy dust. It can just be something that's nice to have, but not necessary, right? So when we think about artists' muse, there's one famous one, Dora Maar, who inspired the artist Pablo Picasso. This is a portrait of Dora Maar, and Picasso has a number of portraits of her and has been described as having been extremely inspired by her beauty and her soul. So what I want to suggest to you is that if you are waiting for motivation to inspire you, then you're like Pablo Picasso in that you are dependent on the muse in order to create your art, right? And that worked beautifully for Pablo Picasso, but what if Dora Maar didn't like him anymore, or wasn't going to show up one day, or just had long periods of time, say the winter, in which she refused to pose for him, right? Then he'd be waiting for that muse to strike, that inspiration, that beauty, and no art would be created, right? So if we stop thinking of motivation as Dora Maar to our Pablo Picasso, right, but start realizing it as just kind of a nice thing to have, but not something you need. You are everything that you need in yourself to accomplish things. You don't need to feel an external source of motivation. You don't need to feel any kind of ephemeral motivation. You can just do whatever it is that you want to do without waiting for that to happen. Okay, thank you. That is my talk. I am now happy to take any questions, and I can stop sharing my slides here. Okay, so one question that I often hear when I talk about motivation in this way is, if you find that you never feel motivated to do your work, is that a sign that you're in the wrong job for you? And I really like this question because it highlights, I think, a misunderstanding of how motivation works. So I've been talking about how motivation is very flighty and fickle. So one thing it would respond to is whether the work is a good fit for you, right? So if you're terrible at a certain task, or you've always disliked that task, then you're probably going to feel unmotivated to do it. But it is not a necessary relationship, right? Such that you may very well feel unmotivated, even though the work is a good fit for you because of other things, right? You have a terrible boss and you don't feel motivated, or, there's, you're not sleeping enough, you're not motivated. There's a lot of things that can make you feel not motivated. And so if you feel like day to day is a grind, you really don't like this job, you're not feeling motivated, I would try to do some mini experiments, because basically motivation is such a general reflection of our feelings and our states that it's really hard to be like, I know why I don't feel motivated, right? And it's easy for us to blame our lack of motivation on something like lack of fit or my boss being a jerk or whatever it might be, most obvious. But there could be other reasons, right? And so I would start, if I were in that condition, by doing some little experiments with my own environment and changing my environment day to day to see why, to see what makes me feel more motivated and what makes me feel less motivated. So that would be and there's a line of research that I think would be really helpful for you if you feel like you're not motivated in what you're doing right now and maybe wondering if this is a good fit for me or not. It is called job crafting. I talked about it in Leo, if you had me for Leo. And it is really helpful. You can Google it. There's a website that has a lot of information. And then I can also send you some academic readings that support it. Basically, what that allows you to do is to question whether you can change things in the workplace or in the way you're approaching your work that might then reignite motivation for you. And there's a lot of research to suggest that it does. Okay, so question here from Robert Coury. Thank you for asking, Robert. So why do you say strategy 2 is controversial? Motivation is a feeling, feelings come and go. Best to practice honoring one's word and give up being stopped by thoughts and feelings. Well, I couldn't agree more. I 100% agree with that. My sense is that that's not really the way psychologists think about motivation or the way that our culture right now talks about motivation, especially among professionals. So I do think there's an acknowledgement that people in some workplaces might not feel motivated and they should just stop fussing and go do their work. But I think there is this idea that in the professional industries that people sort of deserve to feel excited and motivated. And as you say, motivation is a feeling like any other feeling. And what's best is to sort of make a commitment and then follow through. And I really like the way you've said, best to practice honoring one's word and give up being stopped by thoughts and feelings, because one strategy that you can use if you find there are days when you're just not motivated and you're not doing what you need to do, one thing you can do is that when you're motivated, you can pre-commit to certain activities or actions that you know you're not going to want to do when you're feeling unmotivated, but because you have said you will, right? As you've said, Robert, you will honor your word, right? Most of us will honor our word. I know that I'm never going to feel like meeting with my PhD students late in the day because I'm tired. But if I, in the morning when I'm all jazzed and excited about our research, if I set a meeting, I know I will come, right? And so that's the kind of strategy that I think you're talking about, and extremely helpful. Okay, another question from Allison Lynn. How can managers communicate this suggested strategy without demotivating employees who see that energy? Should we, as managers, still seek to motivate employees with purpose, recognition, etc.? Yes, this is a super interesting question, Allison, and it's something I've been thinking about as I was putting together the talk. I really think it's useful as a sort of self-strategy, right? To sort of recognize, hey, I don't need to feel motivated. I can still do things. But overall, there's this massive body of research that shows that motivation is helpful, right? So I absolutely don't think it would be helpful for you to tell your employees, you don't need to feel motivated, just shut up and do your work. I feel like that would go well or be helpful. So what we want, I think, instead is to try to structure the environment so that it makes their work easy to do without them feeling motivated. Because once they get started on a project and start to get that kind of reward that comes from work, they should theoretically feel more motivated. But the other part of that I'll just note is the issue of task design, which I think is something that you are also mentioning here when you talk about purpose and recognition. I highly encourage you to Google task design if you're interested in motivating your employees, because that's the most powerful and long-lasting set of research on that. And so I think there are really easy things you can do to structure the environment, recognizing, again, motivation is flighty and fickle. If someone's not working, it's probably not because they're just an unmotivated person or a lazy person. It's probably because there's something in the environment that's continually cueing them to stop being motivated, right? You are in control of their environment to some extent. And so anything you can do to sort of bolster or, get that motivation going again, I think is absolutely helpful. But I also think that right now we're very focused on motivating our employees. And that certainly it is the case that good performance can occur even from unmotivated employees if the structure and the incentives, et cetera, are set up in an appropriate way. And I'd be happy to discuss that with you if you want to reach out to me. Okay, so message from Jorge. I'm a highly focused person that tries to identify which activities will bring me higher results and tend to neglect small tasks that I don't believe are that important. How can I tackle this problem and do things even when I believe they won't help me that much in the long run? Okay, that's an interesting question, Jorge. I guess I'm not sure that you should, right? If you think small tasks are not that important, I guess if you're getting it wrong, it's a problem, right? So if you're thinking, this isn't that important, I'm not going to do these details, but then that comes back to bite you or other people get angry with you, then I guess I would suggest that you try to change that. But generally, I think this is actually the strategy that most people don't have and that they should have, right? A lot of us are very good at responding to emails and doing small tasks day to day, but tend to ignore those really great activities that will lead to longer term success. So I feel like your strategy is generally good. And if you are finding that you're making mistakes about what's important or not, I think that's really in a kind of goal setting or planning process that you would want to acknowledge all of the details that need to be incorporated in order for you to be successful, right? So you have your goal. I would really then focus on sort of reminding yourself of those lower level goals, which is not what we usually have to do for people in the professional world, but I love that that's your problem. And I feel like having that problem is probably not going to be a huge issue for you. So Omar asks, are there any motivation differences across age groups? It's such a great question, Omar, because I feel like there's currently a way that the media at least are presenting our current cohorts of employees that people who are older have different sort of sources of motivation, et cetera, than people who are younger. What we know is that people are generally happier as they're older and are able to reflect on a longer time period and set longer term goals. Okay, so even though their life is ironically, presumably the lifespan is going to be shorter at this point, because they've had a longer time period, they're able to set and think about longer term goals and think more abstractly about their goals than people who are younger. There's a lovely literature on the lifespan in developmental psychology that looks at what kinds of goals occur at different points in life. And of course, as you might guess, there are these big moments, right, that tend to change people's goals. So leaving home or having children, right? These are things that bring on new goals. And so certainly there are age differences in what goals people are pursuing. But I've not yet seen any cohort effect studies showing that people are more or less motivated at different phases in their life. I feel like certainly the things driving you might change, but I haven't yet seen any big differences there. And Rennie asks if results vary with personality types. It's such a good question. And so we have been looking at that, and actually the only thing we have found so far that does moderate those effects that we showed is perfectionism. So people who are perfectionistic, especially if they have a form of perfectionism called maladaptive perfectionism, where they feel sort of negative about themselves when they don't succeed. So perfectionists, anyway, tend to respond to bumpy progress much more strongly. So people who are low in perfectionism are better able to sort of withstand bumps and stay motivated. People who are more perfectionist are like, oh, I ran slower today, and they feel more upset, and then they feel less motivated, and they're less likely to continue with the goal. So perfectionists have a tendency to be like, I'm either going to be perfect or I'm just getting out of here. And so we are seeing that perfectionism. I would guess that if we had a personality variable to capture what Jorge was saying, a sort of general high-level motivation, I would guess that those people would also be less susceptible day to day, but I don't think we have a variable for that. Okay, I think that's all the questions. So thank you so much for joining me. Remember to join our dean, Bill Boulding, on December 15th. He's going to talk about how business leadership is changing and what leaders need to think about to be prepared for that. You can also follow Fuqua on LinkedIn to be alerted to these kinds of events. Thanks very much. I appreciate the questions very much.